She said she could join us. Really? Sure. That's good to go. We're in good shape. Day at a time. One day at a time. Yeah. How did you enjoy the one day at a time? I'm all in my clothes. I want to know what's going to happen. Got me interested. Who's going to do what?
You guys ready to get started? Good morning. Glad to see you here. Remember, the Zoomers, you are muted. Please stay muted. And at the end, for questions and answers, if you want to write in your chat, your questions, we'll get the speaker to answer your questions. If you have a cell phone, if you can please silence it, it would be greatly appreciated. And Bob Bernstein is going to come up and introduce our speaker for today.
Yeah, and it's a pleasure to have a fellow marine scientist and a friend here today to speak to us. Bob Christian entered marine science as an undergraduate at Great Bay, New Jersey, mentored by Jim Durand at Rutgers University. And his PhD dissertation research was on Sapelo Island, Georgia, under Bill Wiebe at the University of Georgia. And after a few years at Drexel University, Bob spent the rest of his career at East Carolina University. He retired, or at least stopped getting a salary. And we all, many of us know that story. In 2010 as a distinguished professor of biology. So his research is focused on coastal ecosystems along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of the USA and in the Mediterranean. And ecological processes have included nutrient cycling, especially the nitrogen and carbon cycles, energy flow, and responses to environmental change. Much effort has been devoted to network analysis as a mathematical tool for comparison among and within ecosystems. He has been active in promoting large-scale studies. These efforts have been associated with the U.S. long-term ecological research, that's LTER, and international LTER programs, and the Global Terrestrial Observing System, the GTOS of the United Nations. And he served as chair of a panel that developed the plan for the coastal model for GTOS. He's also past president of the International Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation, or SURF. And he's a nice guy and a friend. Welcome, Bob.
Let's see. Are we on? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you for the introduction that I wrote. So, so thank you very much. Oh, I can do this. Take me a few minutes to figure out what I'm doing. And yes, please. Okay. So, okay. So what I'm going to do today is cover a few topics under the rubric of blue carbon in coastal wetlands and how that's involved with climate change issues. So the first thing I want to do is tell you what blue carbon is. And then I want to go back and revisit a little bit of what Bob Bernstein said last week about ecosystem functions and their connection to ecological services or ecosystem services as it relates to coastal ecosystems. I want to talk a little bit about climate change, carbon dioxide and sea level rise and how they're interrelated, and then focus really on salt marshes. The overall talk is will focus on three particular coastal ecosystems: marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. I've dabbled in mangroves and seagrasses. I've spent much of my career in marshes. I feel much more comfortable talking about that. So I want to do a little bit of a deep dive into that relationship between blue carbon, carbon storage, and what marshes have to do in their functioning to stay as marshes, okay, as sea level rises and climate changes. And then finally, I want to dabble in the evaluation of blue carbon of these three wetland types. So what is blue carbon? It's the carbon captured, you can read it there, the carbon captured and stored in the ocean and coastal vegetated ecosystems. Also, it's stored in coral reefs, but we won't talk about that. It's estimated that while these coastal ecosystems represent about 2%, a very small percentage of the ocean, about 50% of the overall ocean's blue carbon is actually occurring in that 2% of the area. And the storage is largely organic, but also carbonate minerals are involved. So this is a diagram of the blue carbon story. If we start on the left and go to the right, we're in the ocean, and really in the ocean, carbon is stored by being carbon dioxide in the air, captured during photosynthesis by the algae in the water, going through the food web. Whatever isn't sort of respired back or given back to the air as carbon dioxide gets essentially dropped in the water column down to deeper waters. And once they're in the deep waters, the residence time is perhaps thousands of years, before those waters and therefore that organic matter ever gets back up into the surface areas. So basically what you're doing is you're storing carbon by putting it in a place where it doesn't decompose very rapidly, namely it's too cold. And number two, that it's not brought back into the surface air very soon. In the case of these wetlands, what happens is you have the plants capturing the carbon dioxide from the air and putting it into plant organic matter, living plants. Some of it goes into a food web, some of it is decomposed, but what doesn't get decomposed gets buried in the soil. And the deeper it gets buried, the farther it is away from the atmosphere and has the potential to promote global warming, essentially. There is also the issue that there is carbon, organic carbon, that was produced by plants in the uplands that comes down with sediments and gets deposited on the marsh, gets buried, and becomes part of that stored carbon within these systems. All right, so here are the three systems. Again, seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes. Let me sort of just get a feeling for what your experiences are. Has everyone played in or near these three systems? Raise your hands if you have. Raise your hands if you never have. Okay, so maybe you have dabbled in some of them. Maybe you've taken a boat over a seagrass or at least looked at a marsh. How many of you have actually walked through a marsh? Okay, you're the people I love. Okay, so, and then how many of you have walked through a mangrove? Oh, quite a few. All right, sort of. Paddle through, like, okay, yeah, it's close enough. Okay, so these are the three systems we're going to focus on. And here's a diagram. The salt marshes are in brown, so we have this image of them being sort of in the northern latitudes, to some extent in the southern latitudes, but they don't show up here. You have mangroves, which are sort of in green, and no, yeah, and they're 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south of the equator, sort of in that band. It starts to, when it gets too cold, you kind of lose the ability to have mangroves. And then the seagrasses are sort of all over the board. Now, it's easy in making a map like this to put dots and say, okay, we know there is a salt marsh there, or it should be one, or a mangrove. It's another thing to actually calculate the area of how much of each of these is there. And that's going to show up later when I get to the end about trying to figure out how important this whole process of blue carbon is in coastal ecosystems, because it depends on the area of these different systems. Oops, okay. All right, so now I want to just kind of go back and revisit what Bob Bernstein talked about last week, which was this idea of ecosystem or ecological services and what they are, and then the how they fit with ecosystem functions and how we use them. And we begin really with ecosystem functions. Ecosystem functions are what ecosystems do to sustain themselves to be what they are. Okay, so the elemental cycling, the food webs, the habitat structure, the ability to process water and organic matter. Okay, these are going to occur in these ecosystems whether or not there are humans around, right? They don't care about the humans other than that the humans do take advantage of these functions, okay? as humans, we then transfer these functions or some of them into services and like food and pollution and abatement and waste and runoff treatment, et cetera. And in particular, the carbon storage, the sequestration, or the blue carbon. And then as we use these services, because we're humans, we have a tendency to overuse them and put pressures on those services, which in turn puts pressure on the functions. So we end up with ecosystems that aren't functioning the way they would if we weren't around. Okay, and a good part of wetland regulations is associated with that loop, that circle of the functioning changing because of the services that are provided and our use of those services. All right, now, here's the dirty little secret in this whole story. For centuries, for millennia, people have viewed wetlands in terms of their disservices. The concept that wetlands provide services is a fairly recent one, probably dating back to the 70s. Okay? Before that, wetlands, especially marshes and mangroves, were considered a place to stay away from, a place to get rid of because of a disservice, primarily the mosquito and the diseases that mosquitoes transmit. So if you look at the management of wetlands from the 30s up to the 60s, it was all, let's dredge these and ditch these marshes and remove the ability of the mosquitoes to produce and the diseases to occur. In fact, if you, the Po River Delta in Italy was actually the wetlands, large sections of those wetlands were reclaimed in the Renaissance period because of malaria and because of the desire to use that land for something else. So ecosystem services were basically ignored until fairly recently. So at any rate, that's that story. Okay, now, how many of you feel you have a grasp on how climate change or at least global warming works? Raise your hand. Okay, well, I'll probably bore you for a while, but maybe I can kind of refresh your memory. But basically, we have this energy balance on the Earth, or any planet does, where the star for that planet, or in this case, the sun, sends down light energy, and that light energy can be reflected, absorbed, converted to heat, and then that heat radiates back into space. The ability to radiate that heat back to space or capture it and keep that atmosphere, and therefore the Earth warm, the surface of the Earth warm, depends on the gases that are in the atmosphere and the kinds of gases. So you're all familiar with the idea that different materials conduct heat in different ways. If you have a frying pan, you use a metal frying pan because it conducts heat very rapidly. Nobody uses a plank of 20 or R20 insulation for making a frying pan, right? Well, the greenhouse effect, the greenhouse gases work like that R20 plank. They essentially absorb the heat or reflect it back into the Earth and warm up the planet. So you can't really see this very well, I guess, but let me take you through this. That there are 4 graphs here. They come from the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, and that's sort of the where a lot of information is synthesized for making regulations and policies about climate change. And by the way, I forgot to pass this around. A lot of what I'm talking about is in a book called The Blue Carbon Primer. It was supposed to be written for just anybody to read, but it's written by scientists, so it really doesn't work that way. But I'm going to pass it around if anybody wants to take a look at it, and I get no royalties from this or anything. At any rate, back here. So, at the basis for climate change is the fact that the temperatures around the Earth are rising. And this diagram has 4 graphs that go from 1850 to about 2014 or 2012, I guess, because this was in the document in 2014. And you can see that over that 100 and plus year period, the top graph, if that's temperature, that temperature has risen. I think somewhere around by that time, what's it, about 2 degrees Celsius? No, less than that. But basically, it's going up, and it's going up mostly during the 20th century. And then if we go to the 3rd slide, or the 3rd graph, that's the carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. They're the 3 sort of dominant greenhouse gases that are absorbing that heat. And you see them all rising, especially the carbon dioxide. And that happens to track very closely the temperature rise. Now, the sort of the theory behind that, the math behind it, the models behind it, taking into account how much absorption occurs by each of those molecule types, carbon dioxide, methane, et cetera, tracks very well with predicting, okay, this is that what the temperature rises would be. So it all kind of fits from a mechanistic point of view. In fact, if you look at the final graph, you have the carbon dioxide in the gray due to fossil fuel, and I think it's cement making and flaring, which is sort of the capturing of gas coming out of gas mines. So anyhow, and again, that all tracks. And if you look at sea level rise, and this is sort of where wetlands are important, coastal wetlands, sea level rise is occurring at about a rate, the rate is actually increasing. It doesn't show up very well there, but it is increasing. An idea of how much increasing, if you go back to the early 1800s, it was about 1 millimeter a year. The global rate, it's now up to about 3.4 million, or millimeters, excuse me. 1 millimeter per year, sort of, say, a couple hundred years ago, to about 3.4 millimeters per year is the most recent estimate I've found. Okay. Now, that's global sea level rise. It turns out that in the world, very, very few things are actually consistent across the entire globe, right? And sea level rise is that way too. If you look at the center panel, the red is where areas where there's faster sea level rise. The cool colors, the blues, are where there's slower or sea level rise or actually decreases in sea level. So it matters where you are, and some of those graphs on the top and the bottom sort of show you in the gray kind of wiggly lines, sort of the where you have a lot of sea level rise, such as in Manila, in the Philippines, or very little or even a decrease as in the northern part of the Atlantic. All right. So what does this have to do with coastal wetlands? Well, if you're a coastal wetland and sea level is rising, you're not going to be there very long unless you rise with it. Okay? So when you are a coastal wetland, like a mangrove or a marsh, and you rise with sea level, you do this by laying down sediment, laying down soil, and that has organic matter in it. And you've taken that organic matter from the atmosphere and put it into the ground, and that is the blue carbon. Now, there's always the ifs, ands, and buts, but that's the overall story. And this spaghetti diagram that you see here is sort of an attempt to show the factors that affect that ability of the wetland to rise and to produce that organic carbon, okay? And it probably isn't worth going into this in any more detail than that. Okay, so what I want to do is talk a little bit about sort of that processes of how does the marsh react to this rising sea level? How does that impact how much organic matter is laid down? So the work that we'll be talking about is on the eastern shore of Virginia. It's property that's owned by the Nature Conservancy. It's the Virginia Coast Reserve and the Long-Term Ecological Research Program, which is a federal program that occurs there. And this is one of the marshes. This is where I spent about 25 years working. And what I'm interested in this case is I'm going to show you how we looked at this marsh and how it might respond to sea level rise, and other marshes might, and then how specifically this one increased in elevation and captured carbon. So this is just basically, if you went from the edge of the water inland, you would see sort of one kind of marsh, we call it the low marsh, and then there's sort of this transitions area, and then the high marsh, and then you see, if you look over on the left and up at the top, you see trees. So this marsh is right next to a forest, and part of what it has to do, if it's going to stay around, is move into that forest. So a lot of the ability of wetlands to stay there as sea level rises is to expand into an upland, which is, the process is called transgression, which is kind of an interesting name. But otherwise, if it just builds up carbon, it's going to be a mound, right? And chances are that becomes an unstable geomorphic feature. This sort of goes through this low and high marsh and the subtitle and a forest. And the way to think about this graph in the context of sea level rise is, let's say you were Rip Van Winkle and you fell asleep in the forest, and you woke up when it started getting wet. And what would happen is, as sea level rise and as the marsh rose in response, that forest then becomes high marsh. And if you're able to fall asleep in the wet for a little bit longer and you wake up, you're in the low marsh, hundreds of years later, perhaps. And then ultimately, you'll be underwater. Okay, so this system is sliding across And each of these ecosystem sort of types is replacing the other as sea level rises in a particular spot, the Rip Van Winkle's sleeping spot. All right. Now, two things are important in this whole story. One is how much photosynthesis occurs, how much carbon is brought in from carbon dioxide, and how much comes in from the edge to lay down new sediment. Okay. The rise of a marsh depends on both. And you could have these four kind of extremes where you have the land slope determines how far it pushes inland. If it's a shallow slope, as you see sort of at the top left, the marsh can slide inland with no trouble. If you've got a steep slope, a cliff, or you have a road or a building or a bulkhead, that stops the marsh from coming in. At the same time, if the sediment supply is low, what you end up doing is that sloshing of the wave action actually erodes the other end of the marsh. Whereas if you've got lots of sediment, it tends to lay down more sediment. So you've got an expanding marsh in the in A, basically, and you have sort of a restricted marsh in D, the most restricted in D. So it's not only the bottom line here is that the sediment or that the elevation increase, the vertical, also has an effect on the horizontal. And if you're talking about storing carbon, then the storage depends a large part on how much area is there to preserve that carbon. All right, so again, here's that marsh. And what I thought I'd like to do is kind of show you how people, oops, sorry about that, show you how people around the world are measuring that elevation change in wetlands, coastal wetlands, marshes and mangroves particularly, but also in seagrasses to some extent. And the technique is called the surface elevation table. And it's extremely laborious, but there are hundreds and hundreds of sites around the world where people are measuring the elevation of their wetland at the millimeter level. You know, if we have sea level rising a couple of millimeters a year, measuring that from year to year is a real chore. So it's a real challenge. So what we do is on the left-hand side is a diagram, and we jam a pipe as deep into the ground as we possibly can. And then at the top of the pipe, we have this arm structure, and you can see sort of the picture up in the upper right-hand corner, that you can bring out to the marsh, sit down, and the pipe is notched, so it fits down in exactly the same spot year after year after year, time after time after time. And then you drop these pins, and you can see that's Mark Brinson for anybody who may know him, and it's Mark Brinson even if you don't know him. And he's dropping a pin down until it touches the surface of the marsh. And if that arm is in the same place year after year after year, then anytime the marsh changes elevation, it's going to change the length of that pin that between the arm and the surface of the marsh. And then you can track how the elevation of the marsh rises or falls relative to the original amount. And you can survey it in and everything. You can also do that in that diagram. You can also do sort of a version that just captures how much elevation change is due to roots. And I won't go into the details of that. The other thing you can do is look at that sediment deposition part of the story. And again, this is done all over the world. at the beginning of the experiment, you lay down feldspar, which is basically potter's clay. It's white. And then over time, that layer of feldspar becomes buried with both the sediment depositing on top and any growth of plants that comes in at the surface. And there's a fair amount. You go out into the field, again, on a yearly basis or every whatever, and you take a tank of liquid nitrogen, and that's what is up there on the right. You pump that liquid nitrogen through a hose into a copper tube that has sort of a bullet end on it. And you jam that into the marsh, turn on the liquid nitrogen, and freezes the marsh around the copper tubing. And we call it a marsh sickle. And you pull it up, and you can see on the bottom there, that white feldspar. You can measure the distance, you know the time, and you can calculate the rate of the surface to where that feldspar has been buried. So now you have ways to see sort of how that marsh is, not only how the elevation has changes, but the processes, sedimentation, root growth, how they affect it. And that's just an example of sort of the elevation as it changed over time. And if you know the time and the elevation total, you can calculate rates by which this marsh is changing elevation and what the processes are that are causing that. So a little deeper dive than you probably wanted to hear today, but I work on marshes. What can I say? All right. So the blue carbon part of the story then is what gets buried, how much does it get buried, how quickly can it get back out and cause a problem again or increase CO2 again. Well, what you really want, so what happens is what is buried most recently is up near the surface. This is sort of the depth into a soil. What is buried most recently is at the top, and that gets processed, right? That gets decomposed. It involves plant material that then gets sort of sucked up as reserves in the wintertime and then replenished in the spring, et cetera. But then you get down around 25, 30 centimeters, and it kind of levels off. So that now you're in a position where this really is deep, old carbon and is really preserved. Okay. Any questions so far on that? Have I still got you with me? Okay. All right, I'm going to skip over that. Basically, there's been a lot of work done on sea level rise and how it affects how the plants grow, because there's sort of a sweet spot of flooding for plants. You flood them too much. When I say plants, I mean marsh plants. You flood them too much, they don't grow as well. You flood them too little, they don't grow as much. But there's that Goldilocks spot. And where they grow the best, they also trap the sediment the best. So you've got this relationship between sea level rise, plant growth, and ability to trap carbon. All right. So where does this take us in terms of the big picture? Okay, so we are now moving into sort of the April Fool's part of the presentation. Okay, because this is the most uncertain part of it. These are estimates that people have made about how much carbon is carbon dioxide in this case, but converted to carbon in each of these different kinds of ecosystems. The three on the bottom are mangroves, marshes, and seagrasses. And on the top is the boreal forest and the tropical forest. And when we think about biomass, we think about how much organic matter is in an ecosystem, you think, okay, forest, got these big trees and everything like that. Well, it turns out that the forests don't produce as much organic matter. These these coastal wetlands are very productive. They have the dual ability to produce organic matter in place and store it, as well as collect it from the surrounding area. So from the point of view of just where carbon is stored, these coastal wetlands are much more important by this study compared to either a boreal forest or a tropical forest. Okay. Now, what about the amount of or the rate at which this carbon is stored? Okay. Now we can think about the rate in two ways. One is per area of carbon or per area of wetland. Okay. So the bar on the left shows you the estimates of the rate per hectare, okay, basically 2.5 acres, the rate per hectare of carbon collection, sequestration, how much goes into organic matter, basically. And so you see basically that the salt marshes and mangroves, about the same. Seagrass is a little bit less, right? If you go to how much is actually buried for all of the seagrasses, for all of the mangroves, for all the salt marshes, as estimated by at least this group, what you find out is that, first of all, there is, if you look at the low estimate and the high estimate of sort of how much each of these ecosystems can get, you find for salt marshes a big difference between, order of magnitude difference between the low estimates of how much carbon is buried in salt marshes versus in the low end versus the high end. That's all based on area of marshes, basically, at this point. Seagrasses, same, not quite so bad. Mangrove, it turns out, I think, that a lot of effort has been put into mapping mangroves. So the estimates of mangroves is pretty good. Okay, so now we move from the amount of carbon. How much is it then? How much carbon, what's the value of that to people? Okay, so there are ways, and I am not an economist. I don't pretend to be one. This is what I've been able to extract. And I want you to note, we talk about uncertainty, we talk about April Fools. Look at the scale on the left, it's a log scale. So we go from 1 to 1 billion, okay? And so that the difference for say a salt marsh is like probably about 80,000 or 80 million up to what's that? That's over a billion or about a billion. The blue and the orange for salt marshes. So again, big differences in the estimate when you talk about a global scale. And there aren't a lot of estimates that I have found. And they're really all over the board, except for the mangroves. And the mangroves, pretty stable, again, because the estimates of the area of mangroves is pretty much the same. Now, finally, you say, okay, we have an idea then of what the rate of what the value is per year of carbon extraction, what about estimates of all the ecosystem services? The food, the protection against hazards, et cetera. Well, that's the light blue one. And again, we're in a log scale. So really, the overall estimates are huge compared to that of organic carbon sequestration. So the bottom line is, it's important. We don't know a lot about the final analysis and synthesis associated with the globe and these coastal wetlands. But we also know that right now it appears that it's a small part of the many ecosystem services that these ecosystems provide. So that is where I pretty much can stop. I can put this on. Oops. Oh, this is a breakdown, by the way, of I wasn't done. If my students would be halfway out the door by now, right? The other half would have already left. But this is just a comparison of mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes by one estimate. Their value, again, on a log scale. And the top is the organic matter accumulation, that's the blue carbon. And you look at some of these like pollution regulation for salt marshes, fisheries, and natural hazard protections, and they're all much higher. So it's not negligible. It's an important part of the whole process of abating climate change. And it's free as long as we don't screw it up. So I'll answer any questions. I'll try.
I know that Bob took on a tough charge of trying to convert some of those services to dollars. I'll note that one of the last figures of 14 up to 14 trillion is about half the U.S. gross domestic product, the value of everything we produce. So these natural systems are really valuable. Question?
One of your slides showed cement making as a carbon source. Now, I think all of us have been out with large outcroppings of limestone and we're impressed by how much carbon must be in there. But how does that get released? I would have suspected that was still sequestered.
It is released in, I should have looked that up. I knew this at one time. It's released in the process of adding the lime to the mix, and the chemistry is such that you get a release of CO2 and carbon dioxide from playing with the carbonates, from playing with the lime.
Thank you for your work. I'm just curious, mangroves were disappearing at quite a rate in Florida. Have you heard any statistics on what's happening now?
No. Bob, do you know offhand, or does anybody in here know? I'm just learning about Florida right now. We've been here 2 years, so but my hope is that the regulations are such that it's slowed down.
Thank you for the insight. Each one of these areas that you talked about are kind of looking at a static area. But all of these areas are coastal, and at the coast, there's a current. And to what extent do currents like the Gulf Current from, the Caribbean to the Arctic and around to Britain, to what extent do these sort of help or hurt your static look at a given area?
I think you're talking about currents that are offshore. Okay, so probably the current itself is beyond the direct effect on these systems for the most part. The indirect effects would be that you've got changes in the fish populations, the nekton populations that are responding to changes in the currents, especially temperature changes in the currents, their intensity and position. And that's going to affect the food webs in ways that are probably unfathomable right now. That would be one way. The other way, I'd say that sediment load is really important. Right. And so, again, if you're talking about the Gulf current, I don't know that those sediment particles that are in there have an effect on the marsh. It's usually an alluvial kind of situation where you're getting most of the sediments either from rivers. One thing, if you look at seagrasses, one place where current matters, when you look at seagrasses, you have basically no seagrasses in Florida, not Florida, in Georgia and South Carolina. And there's two major things. One is this major tidal signal in those two areas. And two, the importance of these muddy rivers coming down and, laying down, depositing sediment and giving high turbidity in those systems. So, I don't know if I answered your question, but they're the things that come to mind right away.
Bob, I'll follow up. What is maybe a possible impact that most marshes or coastlines are protected by barrier islands, but barrier islands we know are not static.
Yeah. Yeah. So you do have,
They're migrating inland.
right, you have these barrier islands that are migrating inland, disappearing. You have back barrier island marshes. You have protected areas for seagrasses or mangroves. So yeah, that would be the coastal currents would impact potentially those things. Again, how much that versus storms is it's the episodic events, or is it these long-term stresses that come about? So, yeah.
Any other questions then? Thank you. Oh,
Yeah, just a remark. Is most of this information getting to people like developers? Because, for example, in St. Augustine, last week or 2 weeks ago, I attended a planning and zoning meeting, and they're talking about putting in 56 units of quarter lots and so forth right on the coast, essentially, destroying the marsh and everything that's there and the trees. And that doesn't mean anything to them. Developers have money, but this is some ammunition that could be used, and it's not getting there. Unfortunately, it's not your fault. It's a matter of the way people think. But anyway, any thoughts on that?
Again, you're talking about a value system that is very different, right? I mean, the ecosystem values, ecosystem services, that's a hard sell if your values, look at the disservices, right? And they say, oh, but we're covering up this marsh because it will take you too long to walk your boat because you have to do it over
But I agree that if they're talking dollars for development and you say, well, this salt marsh is really valuable. If you could talk dollars to dollars, you have some. I appreciate the effort. The charge of doing an economic value is difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And let's give
Okay.
Bob a hand.